A mother went shopping but never returned. 14 years later, her family discovers the shocking reason. The evening sunlight filtered through the half-drawn curtains of the Dawson family living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Dan Dawson, now 50 years old, adjusted his position in his wheelchair, wincing slightly as he shifted his weight. It had been 14 years since the accident, a sudden stroke that sent him tumbling down the stairs, leaving him with a broken hip and confined to a wheelchair. Though time had passed, the physical limitations remained a constant reminder of how dramatically his life had changed. "Dad, do you want a blanket?" Ellie called from the kitchen, already pulling one from the hall closet before he could answer. At 19, she was the only one of his children who still lived at home, shouldering the responsibility of his daily care with a maturity beyond her years. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Dan replied, his voice carrying a perpetual weariness that had become part of his personality. "What time did Ethan say he'd be here?" Mark, Dan's second oldest son at 25, checked his phone. "He said around 6, should be here any minute." Mark had his father's build, broad shoulders and the same cleft in his chin, but his temperament was more measured, practical. He worked as an accountant at a firm downtown, having put himself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs after their mother disappeared. "Aldi, could you please lower the volume?" Leah called from the dining room where she was setting the table. At 23, she had grown into a responsible young woman who managed a local bookstore. Her shoulder-length dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail as she moved efficiently between the kitchen and dining room. 15-year-old Aldi, sprawled on the couch with the remote in hand, reluctantly turned down the sports highlights he'd been watching. "I'm just looking for a good movie for tonight," he defended himself, scrolling through streaming options. "What about that new science fiction one? The one with the aliens that look like humans?" "No aliens," Dan said with a small smile. "You know Ellie doesn't like them." Ellie appeared from the kitchen carrying a stack of plates. "I don't mind aliens. I just don't like when they explode out of people's chests while we're eating dessert." The familiar banter filled the house with warmth, a testament to how they'd managed to forge ahead as a family despite everything. Every weekend they gathered like this, all 5 children coming together for dinner, conversation, and a movie. It was their ritual, their way of maintaining the connections that had kept them strong through the years of absence. "The table's ready," Leah announced, stepping back to admire her handiwork. 5 place settings with a 6th at the head of the table for Ethan, each plate perfectly aligned, glasses filled with ice water, napkins folded neatly beside forks and knives, everything in its proper place, just as their mother had taught her. "Something smells amazing," Mark said, making his way to the dining room. "Lasagna," Ellie replied proudly, "and I made garlic bread too." Aldi abandoned his movie search and joined them at the table, his gangly teenage frame folding into his usual chair. "Can we start?" "I'm starving." Dan wheeled himself to his spot at the table, shaking his head. "We wait for Ethan. We always wait until everyone's here." "But the food's getting cold," Aldi complained, eyeing the steaming dish at the center of the table. "I'll call him," Mark offered, already dialing his brother's number. After a moment, he frowned. No answer. Voicemail. They sat in silence, the minutes ticking by. The lasagna ceased steaming. The ice in their water glasses began to melt. Dan checked his watch repeatedly, worry lines deepening across his forehead. Just as Leah was about to suggest they start without Ethan, they heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, followed by the slamming of a car door. The front door burst open and Ethan rushed in, his 30-year-old face flushed with excitement and concern. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, tie loosened, top button undone, dark hair falling across his forehead. He glanced around the dining room, taking in the scene of his family seated around the table waiting for him. "Sorry I'm late," he said breathlessly, but there was something in his voice, an urgency, a tension that immediately put everyone on alert. "It's fine, we were just about to—" Dan began, but Ethan cut him off. "I found something," he blurted out, pulling out his chair but remaining standing. "About Mom." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Shoulders tensed, Faces hardened. "I got a call from Detective Vans today," Ethan continued, fumbling with his phone. "They found something. I need to show you." "Sit down, Ethan," Dan said firmly. "We've been waiting for you. The food's getting cold." "Dad, you don't understand. This is important." Ethan remained standing, clutching his phone like a lifeline. "Just give me 1 minute." "Your father's right," Mark interjected, his voice calm but authoritative. "Let's eat first. Whatever it is can wait until after dinner." Ethan looked around the table, desperate for an ally, but found none. Leah was studying her plate. Ellie was biting her lip nervously. Aldi was staring at him with a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. "We talked about this," Leah said quietly. "We agreed not to bring up Mom anymore, not during family time." "But this is different," Ethan insisted. "The police found—" "Enough!" Mark's voice rose sharply. "We know what happened. She left us. She couldn't handle it anymore. Dad's accident, the medical bills, 5 kids to raise on her own. She met someone else and took off." "That's not true," Ethan shot back. "Mom would never—" "She did, though, didn't she?" Leah joined in, her calm facade cracking. "Dad's in a wheelchair. We're drowning in debt from his medical bills, and suddenly she's gone without a trace. What would you call that?" 14 years, Ethan," Mark added, his voice softening slightly. 14 years without a word. No calls, no letters, nothing. What more proof do you need?" The heated exchange escalated, voices overlapping as years of pain and resentment bubbled to the surface. Aldi shrunk in his seat, while Ellie looked helplessly between her arguing siblings. "Enough!" Dan's voice thundered through the room, followed immediately by a wheezing cough that bent him double in his wheelchair. The fighting stopped instantly. Ellie jumped up to pat her father's back, offering him water as the coughing subsided. "I'm sorry, Dad," she murmured, then addressed her siblings. "Please, let's not do this. Dad's been looking forward to tonight all week. He misses us. Can't we just have one peaceful dinner?" A heavy silence settled over the table, broken only by Dan's ragged breathing as he recovered from his coughing fit. "Fine," Ethan finally said, sliding into his chair. His jaw was tight with frustration. "But I need you all to know that this isn't just another dead-end lead. The police found Mom's car. It was submerged in a river." Despite their determination to dismiss him, this revelation caused all heads to snap up in attention. "What?" Dan's voice was barely audible. "Detective Vans called me this afternoon," Ethan continued, sensing his opening. "They found her car in a river. That's why I was late. I was on the phone with him getting details." Dan turned to Ellie. "Get my phone from the side table, please." She quickly retrieved it, watching as her father scrolled through his notifications with trembling fingers. His face paled. 4 missed calls from Detective Vans, he confirmed, looking up at Ethan. Did they find her body?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. The detective said they're still processing the scene. He said it would help if we could come down there." The family exchanged glances, the dinner forgotten as the reality of this new development sank in. "We should eat something first," Ellie suggested, breaking the stunned silence. Her practical nature took over as she looked at her father with concern. "Dad needs to take his medication with food, and it'll just take a few minutes." Mark nodded in agreement. "She's right. Let's eat quickly, then we can go." They ate in tense silence, the once appetizing lasagna now tasteless in their mouths. Forks scraped against plates as they hurried through the meal, minds racing with questions none of them dared to voice aloud. When they'd eaten enough to justify leaving, Mark and Aldi began clearing the table while Leah and Ellie helped Dan prepare for the unexpected outing. Ellie gathered his medication and a blanket, while Leah collected his wallet and phone. "Are you sure you want to go, Dad?" Ellie asked softly as she helped him adjust his sweater. "We could stay here while the others check it out." Dan shook his head firmly. "I need to be there." Outside, the evening had grown darker, a chill settling in the air that hadn't been there when they'd gathered for dinner. The old family SUV, modified to accommodate Dan's wheelchair, stood waiting in the driveway of their modest home. A single-story ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by mature oak trees that had witnessed the family's joys and sorrows for decades. Ethan and Mark carefully helped their father from his wheelchair and into the passenger seat, folding the wheelchair and storing it in the back. Leah, Ellie, and Aldi climbed into the middle row while Ethan took the driver's seat. "I'll drive," he said, adjusting the mirrors. "I know exactly where we're going." As he backed out of the driveway, Ethan couldn't help but notice how the house looked from the outside. Porch light on, warm glow from the windows spilling onto the lawn. It looked like any other family home on a quiet evening. No one passing by would guess the turmoil that churned within its walls, or the gaping absence that had shaped their lives for 14 years. The car rolled down the familiar streets of their small town, past the high school where all 5 children had attended, past the grocery store where their mother had supposedly gone the day she disappeared. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to maintain the speed limit despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What exactly did Detective Vans tell you?" Dan asked, breaking the silence that had settled over the car. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Not much, just that they found Mum's car in a river while investigating something else. He didn't give details over the phone." "After all this time," Leah murmured from the back seat. "Why now?" No one had an answer for her. Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming message. "That's the detective," he said, glancing at it briefly. "He's sending the exact location. It's at Miller's Lake." "That's nearly 30 minutes from here," Mark noted. "What would Mum's car be doing all the way out there?" The unspoken implication hung in the air. Miller's Lake was remote, secluded, the kind of place someone might go if they didn't want to be found. The remainder of the drive passed in uneasy silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts. As they left the town behind, the streetlights became scarcer, and the road narrowed. Ethan flipped on the high beams as they turned onto an unpaved access road that wound through dense woods toward the lake. The SUV bounced and jostled over the uneven terrain, forcing Ethan to slow down as he navigated the rutted path. After several minutes, the trees parted to reveal the glittering surface of Miller's Lake, its dark waters reflecting the flashing lights of police vehicles parked along the shore. Ethan parked as close as he could to the scene, turning to his father. "Are you ready?" Dan nodded, his face set in grim determination. Mark and Leah helped him from the car into his wheelchair, while Ellie placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. As they opened the car doors, the smell hit them immediately. Stagnant water, mud, and something else, something unpleasant that spoke of things long submerged and recently disturbed. Aldi wrinkled his nose, hanging back slightly as his older siblings pushed their father's wheelchair toward the police perimeter. The damp earth made pushing the wheelchair difficult, and Mark and Leah had to work together to help Dan across the uneven ground, the wheels occasionally sinking into soft patches of mud. Ellie stayed close by her father's side, her arm linked with his as they approached the gathered law enforcement officers. Ethan walked ahead of his family, scanning the crowd of law enforcement personnel for a familiar face. He spotted Detective Vans standing near the edge of the water, deep in conversation with a uniformed officer. The detective was a stocky man in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the perpetually tired expression of someone who had seen too much in his career. "Detective Vans?" Ethan called out, approaching with quick strides. The detective turned, recognition flashing across his weathered features. "Ethan, you made it." His eyes moved past Ethan to the rest of the family making their way across the muddy shoreline. "I see you brought everyone." "We needed to be here," Ethan replied simply. "What did you find?" Detective Vans gestured toward the lake where a tow truck was positioned, its powerful winch having already completed its work. Sitting on the shore, dripping with lake water and covered in silt and aquatic plants, was a car, or what remained of one. Despite the years underwater, there was no mistaking the faded blue sedan that had once belonged to Catherine Dawson. "We found it early this afternoon," Detective Vans explained as the rest of the family joined them. "We weren't looking for it, to be honest. We had a helicopter searching the area as part of an ongoing drug trafficking investigation. The pilot spotted something reflecting in the lake from above." Dan stared at the waterlogged vehicle, his face unreadable. Did you find... He couldn't finish the question. No bodies, Detective Vans answered, understanding the unasked question. That's what's strange. The car was empty when we pulled it up. Empty, Mark repeated, surprised. Are you sure? Completely empty, the detective confirmed, but we did find some interesting items inside. What kind of items? Ethan asked eagerly. Detective Vans reached into his pocket and produced a sealed evidence bag containing a water-damaged photograph. This was in the glove compartment, sealed in a plastic bag which preserved it somewhat. It's a photograph of your mother. Dan reached out with trembling hands to take the bag, staring at the faded image of Catherine, smiling, carefree, in a moment captured before her disappearance. There was something else, the detective continued, his voice taking on a more careful tone. We found items belonging to a man, a pair of men's sunglasses, a baseball cap, a receipt with a man's name on it. I knew it, Leah said suddenly, her voice bitter. She did run off with someone. That's not fair, Ethan protested immediately. We don't know that. What else could it be? Mark challenged. Mum's car at the bottom of a lake, men's belongings inside, no sign of Mum herself. It's pretty clear she staged her own disappearance. Our investigation suggests the car was deliberately sunk, Detective Vans added. There's no damage consistent with an accident. The windows were rolled down, allowing it to fill with water and sink. There's no evidence of violence or foul play. She knew what she was doing was illegal, Leah said, crossing her arms over her chest. Abandoning her minor children. She couldn't just walk away without consequences, so she made it look like something had happened to her. That's absurd, Ethan shot back. Mom would never abandon us. There has to be another explanation. Aldi, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Why would she leave us when Dad needed her the most, when we all needed her? Sometimes people break, Mark said quietly. The pressure gets to be too much. Dad's medical bills, 5 kids to raise, no help. She found a way out and she took it. Ethan turned desperately to Detective Vans. You don't really believe that, do you? After all these years, there must be more to the story. The detective sighed heavily. I've been doing this job for 27 years, Ethan. I've seen it before. People disappear because they want to, and they go to extraordinary lengths to cover their tracks. But why find the car now? Dan asked, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. After 14 years. Like I said, we weren't looking for it, Detective Vans explained. We were conducting aerial surveillance for a drug operation in this area. The helicopter spotted the car from above. You can sometimes see objects underwater from that angle, especially when the sun hits just right. Pure coincidence. He pulled out another evidence bag containing a small water-damaged object. This is what identified the car as your mother's. Her driver's license was in the center console, along with this family photograph. Dan took the second evidence bag, staring at the water-damaged but still recognizable family portrait. Himself, Catherine, and all 5 children, taken just months before her disappearance and his accident. So what happens now? Mark asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Detective Vans rubbed the back of his neck. We'll process the car fully, see if we can find any other evidence, but I have to be honest with you, this is a 14-year-old case. We don't have the resources to mount a full-scale investigation unless we find something that clearly indicates foul play. So that's it, Ethan demanded. You're just going to assume she ran off and forget about it. I didn't say that, the detective replied patiently, but the evidence is pointing in a particular direction. No signs of struggle, no body, deliberate sinking of the vehicle, men's items in the car. It supports the theory that she left voluntarily. I can provide you with copies of all the evidence we've collected if you'd like, he added, looking around at the family. Photos, inventory lists, our preliminary findings. What's the point? Leah said, her voice hollow. It won't change anything. Dan, who had been mostly silent, suddenly spoke up. Ellie, I'd like to go home now. I'm tired. Of course, Dad, Ellie said softly, moving behind his wheelchair. Do whatever you need to do with the car, Dan told Detective Vans. We've lived with this mystery for 14 years. I'm not sure finding the truth now will bring us any peace." The family began to turn away, but Ethan remained rooted to the spot. "I'd like those copies," he said firmly. Detective Vans nodded, reaching into his vehicle to retrieve a manila envelope. "I had them prepared, just in case. There's also a separate envelope containing copies of some items we found in the glove compartment. My team photographed everything when we first pulled the car out." He handed the envelope to Ethan, then placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "I've worked dozens of missing persons cases over the years. It's often the firstborn who has the hardest time letting go. I hope these help you find some closure, son." Ethan stared at the envelope in his hands. "Thank you." As he walked back to where his family waited by their car, he could feel the weight of the evidence, physical and emotional, pressing down on him. Despite what everyone seemed to believe, Ethan couldn't accept that his mother had simply abandoned them. There had to be more to the story, and perhaps the answers lay within the envelope he now clutched to his chest. The family piled back into the SUV, their earlier anticipation now deflated into a heavy silence. Mark slid into the driver's seat this time, taking the keys from Ethan without a word. "I'll drive," he said simply, starting the engine while the others settled in. Ethan climbed into the back row, claiming the space for himself so he could examine the contents of the envelope. As the car pulled away from Miller's Lake, he turned on his phone's flashlight and began sifting through the papers. The first pages were standard police reports, descriptions of the recovery operation, inventory lists of items found in the car, photographs of the vehicle from various angles, showing its deteriorated condition after 14 years underwater. Ethan studied each page carefully, looking for anything that might contradict the abandonment narrative, but finding little to support his belief in his mother's devotion. Mark drove more aggressively than Ethan had on the way to the lake, taking turns sharply and accelerating hard-on straightaways. The jostling made it difficult for Ethan to focus on the documents. "Could you slow down a bit?" he called to the front, but Mark either didn't hear or chose to ignore him. After a few more minutes of trying to read through the bouncing and swaying, Ethan reluctantly returned the papers to the envelope, deciding to wait until they returned home. Or better yet, until he was alone in his own apartment where he could study everything properly without judgmental glances from his siblings. The drive back to their father's house passed in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional sigh from Dan in the passenger seat. When they finally pulled into the driveway, the porch light still glowing welcomingly, Aldi was the first to break the tension. "Are we still watching a movie?" he asked cautiously, glancing around at his family members. "We don't have to end the night like this, do we?" The question hung in the air for a moment, before Leah nodded slowly. "I think that would be good. We still have dessert waiting, and it would be a shame to waste the evening." "Dad?" Ellie looked to her father for confirmation. Dan managed a small smile. "Yes, I think we could all use the distraction." They helped Dan back into his wheelchair and made their way inside. Mark and Leah headed straight for the living room, turning on the TV and scrolling through options, while Ellie went to the kitchen to retrieve the apple pie she'd baked earlier. Aldi hovered uncertainly between groups before joining his older siblings at the TV. Ethan remained by the door, the envelope still clutched in his hands. "I'm not staying," he announced. The others turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Dan asked. "I'm going home," Ethan replied. "I want to go through these files properly. There might be something important." "Ethan," Mark interrupted, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Let it go. We've finally got some answers after 14 years. It's not what we wanted to hear, but at least now we know." "We don't know anything," Ethan insisted. "All we have is a car in a lake and a bunch of assumptions." "Please stay," Ellie said quietly. "Just for the movie. We can talk about all of this tomorrow when everyone's had time to process." Ethan looked at his youngest sister, her face open and pleading, then at his father, slumped slightly in his wheelchair, looking older and more tired than he had just hours ago. For a moment he considered relenting, sitting through a movie he wouldn't watch, pretending everything was fine while his mind raced with questions. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I need to do this." Without waiting for further objections, he stepped back through the door and walked to his car. Through the front window, he could see his family gathering around the TV, settling into their usual spots. Dan in his wheelchair positioned at the end of the couch, Ellie perched on the armrest beside him, the others spreading out across the remaining furniture. Ethan sat in his car for a moment, keys in the ignition but engine not yet started. "Where are you, Mom?" he whispered into the empty vehicle. "What happened to you? Did you really leave us?" He wiped at his eyes, angry at the tears that threatened to fall. "I was the oldest," he muttered. "After Dad's accident, I was the one who had to step up. I got a job instead of going to college right away. I helped with the kids. I did everything I could to hold us together. And now they all hate me because I won't accept that you abandoned us." Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Ethan turned on the engine and switched on the interior light. He opened the envelope again, spreading the documents across the passenger seat. This time he noticed a smaller envelope within, labeled simply miscellaneous. Curious, he opened it to find photocopies of personal items and documents that had been recovered from the car. Among them was some kind of lease agreement, though it wasn't clear due to the water damage but still partially legible. Ethan stared at it in confusion. It was dated approximately 3 months after his mother's disappearance, but the name on the lease wasn't Catherine Dawson. Instead, it bore an unfamiliar name, Elizabeth Carter. What caught Ethan's attention, however, was the signature at the bottom of the page. Though faded and blurry in the photocopy, he recognized his mother's distinctive handwriting immediately. The same looping C she used to sign his school permission slips, the same swooping E that appeared in all her shopping lists. "Elizabeth Carter," he whispered, staring at the signature. "Mum used a fake name." His heart racing, Ethan studied the document more carefully. There was an address listed on the lease. Pulling out his phone, Ethan quickly typed the address into a mapping application. The satellite view showed a property located in what appeared to be an industrial zone on the outskirts of the city, miles from their home and far from any residential area. It wasn't a house or apartment building, but what appeared to be a warehouse or storage facility in an area dominated by similar industrial buildings. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. "Why would Mom rent a warehouse under a false name?" Then he noticed something else on the lease, the name Raymond Doss. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but Ethan couldn't immediately place it. He typed it into a search engine, and the results made his blood run cold. Multiple news articles appeared, dating back years. Local businessman Raymond Doss questioned in money laundering investigation. Doss cleared of fraud charges due to lack of evidence. Raymond Doss properties linked to illegal loan operations. Ethan read through several of the articles, piecing together a picture of a man who operated on the fringes of legality. Someone involved in predatory lending practices and other questionable business dealings that law enforcement had never quite been able to prove. He looked back at the house, where through the window he could see his family watching the movie together. For a moment, he considered going back inside, showing them what he'd found, but he knew they wouldn't listen. They'd made up their minds about what happened to their mother, and no lease agreement or suspicious landlord would change that. "I'll do this myself," Ethan decided, putting the car in reverse and backing out of the driveway. Rather than heading toward his own apartment, he pointed the car in the direction of the address on the lease agreement, determined to find out what connection his mother had to Raymond Doss and why she would rent a warehouse under a false name. The GPS guided Ethan through streets that gradually gave way to less maintained roads as he approached the industrial district. Streetlights became scarcer and the buildings more dilapidated, abandoned factories with broken windows, storage facilities surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire, and the occasional all-night truck stop casting pools of harsh fluorescent light onto empty parking lots. After 20 minutes of driving, the GPS announced that he had reached his destination. Ethan slowed the car, peering through the windshield at a weathered single-story building set back from the road. A faded sign hung askew above the entrance, "Quality Furniture Refurbishing." Ethan pulled into the gravel lot, parking a short distance from the building. The place appeared to be operational, but barely. A dim light glowed from within, and an old pickup truck was parked by a side entrance. As his headlights illuminated the facade, he could see that the windows were covered from the inside, preventing any view of the interior. He cut the engine but remained in the car, considering his next move. He hadn't planned this far ahead, hadn't thought about what he would do when he actually found the place. It was nearly 10 p.m. now, and he doubted anyone would be working this late, yet there was clearly someone inside. As he debated whether to approach the building or return in the daylight, a figure emerged from a side door. An older man carrying a steaming cup in a plastic container. The man noticed Ethan's car immediately and began walking toward it with a measured, deliberate pace. Ethan's instinct was to drive away, but something told him this might be his only chance to learn something about this place and its connection to his mother. He rolled down his window as the man approached. The security guard, for that seemed to be his role, was older than Ethan had initially thought, perhaps in his early 60s, but moved with the confidence and strength of someone much younger. Despite the late hour and cool temperature, he wore only a light jacket over a uniform shirt with no company logo. His face was weathered but alert, eyes sharp as they assessed Ethan. "Evening," the man said, his voice surprisingly genial. "You lost? Not many folks find themselves out here this time of night unless they took a wrong turn." Ethan hesitated, rapidly calculating his approach. The truth seemed too risky. He couldn't just announce he was investigating his long-missing mother's connection to this place. Instead, he opted for a plausible lie. "I think you were right, I might have missed a turn," Ethan replied with forced casualness. "But as I was driving by, I noticed this place. You see, I run a small business and I've been looking for warehouse space in the area. I know it's late, but I saw the light on and thought I'd check it out." The guard took a sip of his coffee, studying Ethan over the rim of the cup. "This ain't for sale, if that's what you're wondering." "Who owns it?" Ethan asked, trying to sound merely curious. "Harvey Doss," the guard replied. Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the familiar surname. "Harvey Doss? I don't think I've heard of him." The guard raised an eyebrow. "Son of Raymond Doss. You never heard of Raymond Doss?" Ethan shook his head, feigning ignorance. "Should I have?" "Raymond owned half the industrial property in this area," the guard explained. "Passed away a few years back. His son Harvey took over the business." "I see," Ethan said, mind racing. "Is there any way to get in touch with Harvey? If not to buy the place, maybe to discuss renting part of it?" The guard chuckled. "Harvey's a private man. Doesn't deal directly with folks, especially not those who show up unannounced after hours." "Is there someone else I could talk to then? A manager or representative, perhaps tomorrow?" The guard seemed to consider this for a moment. "Tell you what, come back tomorrow during business hours. Ask for Ronald. He handles Harvey's affairs here." "Ronald," Ethan repeated, committing the name to memory. "He'll definitely be here tomorrow. I reports to him and I got his number. I can let him know tonight that someone's interested." "That would be great," Ethan said, deliberately not offering his own number. "I'll just stop by tomorrow." The guard nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "Ronald likes to conduct business face-to-face. Just so you know, he doesn't appreciate folks bringing outsiders or partners to these initial meetings. Likes to size people up one-on-one first." "I understand," Ethan replied. "I'll come alone." He was about to roll his window back up when a thought struck him. If he left now, he'd have learned nothing concrete, just confirmed that the Doss family still owned the property. Taking a calculated risk, he called out to the guard who had already begun walking away. "One more thing," he said. "I don't suppose you've ever heard of a woman named Elizabeth Carter around this area?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. The guard's entire demeanor changed, his shoulders stiffening and face hardening into an expressionless mask. The affable security man vanished, replaced by someone much more dangerous. "You need to leave," he said flatly, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Now." Ethan, realizing he'd overplayed his hand but unwilling to retreat entirely, pressed further. "I just need to know if—" The guard moved with surprising speed, closing the distance to the car in 2 long strides. He placed his weathered hands on the edge of Ethan's partially open window and leaned in, his face inches from Ethan's. "You want ghosts?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. You're in the right place. She didn't want to be found. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. What do you mean? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Who didn't want to be found? The guard straightened up, rapping his knuckles against the doorframe. If you want to talk about that too, come see Ronald tomorrow, but I'd advise against it. He knocked on the car frame once more. You'd better go now. Ethan hesitated only briefly before putting the car in reverse. He backed away slowly, watching as the guard remained standing in the same spot, tracking him with cold eyes, until Ethan turned the car around and drove away. His mind was racing as he navigated back toward the town. The guard had clearly recognized Elizabeth Carter, his mother's fake name, and his reaction confirmed that Elizabeth, or Catherine, had some connection to this place. But what did he mean about ghosts? And why would he say she didn't want to be found, if not to confirm that his mother had disappeared voluntarily? None of it made sense, yet for the first time in 14 years, Ethan felt he was finally on the trail of something real, something that might explain what had happened to his mother. The dashboard clock read 11:35 p.m. as Ethan drove back toward the town, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of questions and theories. The implications seemed to support what his siblings believed, that their mother had chosen to disappear. But something about the guard's reaction, the sudden shift from friendly to threatening, suggested there was more to the story than a woman simply walking away from her life. Ethan knew he should share what he'd discovered with his family, but after their reaction at dinner and the lake, he doubted they would listen. They had made peace, in their own ways, with their mother's abandonment. Mark had become the practical, responsible one. Leah had hardened herself against further disappointment. Ellie had channeled her energy into caring for their father. And Aldi, who had been barely a year old when Catherine disappeared, had never really known her at all. None of them wanted to reopen old wounds except Ethan, who had never accepted the abandonment narrative in the first place. There was, however, someone else who might be interested in what he'd found. Ethan pulled over to the side of the road and found Detective Vance's card in his wallet. He hesitated before dialing, aware of how the detective might react to learning Ethan had gone to investigate on his own, but ultimately decided the information was too important to keep to himself. The detective answered on the fourth ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Vance here. Detective, it's Ethan Dawson. I'm sorry to call so late. There was a rustling sound as if the detective was sitting up in bed. Ethan, is everything all right? I found something in the evidence copies you gave me, Ethan said, deciding to ease into the full truth. There was some kind of contract or lease agreement in the miscellaneous envelope. The address there pointed to a warehouse rented under the name Elizabeth Carter. But the signature, it's my mother's handwriting. I saw that, Detective Vance confirmed, sounding more awake now. It caught my attention too. Why didn't you mention it earlier? Ethan asked, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. Because it fits with what we already suspected, the detective replied patiently. People who disappear voluntarily often establish new identities. They rent places under fake names, set up new lives. But it's not a house or an apartment, Ethan pressed. It's a warehouse in an industrial zone, and the landlord is Raymond Doss. Did you look him up? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Yes, I did. Raymond Doss was a well-known figure in certain circles. His businesses operated in grey areas of the law, predatory loans, debt collection practices that skirted legal boundaries. He was investigated several times but never successfully prosecuted. So why would my mother rent a property from someone like that? That's where I think this all connects, Detective Vance said. Based on the evidence we've gathered, I believe your mother needed to disappear quickly and completely. Raymond Doss's operations included helping people do exactly that, for a price. That warehouse was likely a transition point, a place where people went to get new identities before moving on. You think she went there to change her identity? Ethan asked incredulously. To start a new life? It makes sense with the timing, the detective replied. The lease is dated 3 months after her disappearance. That would give her time to make arrangements, possibly with a new partner. What new partner? Ethan demanded. There's no evidence she was seeing anyone. The sunglasses we found in the car, Detective Vans reminded him. Men's sunglasses with the name Ronald carved into one of the arms. Ethan nearly dropped the phone. Ronald? He repeated, his pulse quickening. You're sure the name was Ronald? Positive, the detective confirmed. Why? Does that name mean something to you? Ethan's mind was racing. The guard at the warehouse had mentioned Ronald, said he handled Harvey Doss's affairs, that Ethan should come back tomorrow to meet with him. Was it possible this was the same Ronald whose sunglasses were found in Catherine's car? Ethan? Detective Vans prompted. Are you still there? I'm here, he finally replied. I did something I probably shouldn't have. After I found the lease agreement, I drove to the address on it. You did what? The detective's voice rose sharply. Ethan, that was incredibly reckless. If there is any connection between your mother's disappearance and Raymond Doss's operations... I know, Ethan cut in, but I did learn something. There was a security guard there, and when I mentioned my mother's name, he reacted. He knew who she was, detective. And he mentioned someone named Ronald who works there, possibly the same Ronald whose sunglasses were in Mom's car. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Detective Vans spoke again, his voice was measured, controlled. Ethan, I need you to listen very carefully. These people are dangerous. If they're involved in your mother's disappearance, they won't hesitate to protect themselves. I don't want you going anywhere near that warehouse again, understood? But... No buts, the detective interrupted firmly. This is now an active police investigation. We'll handle it properly with warrants and backup. Your involvement could jeopardize everything, not to mention put you in serious danger. Ethan gripped the phone tighter. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit and wait? That's exactly what you're supposed to do, Detective Vans confirmed. I appreciate you sharing this information, but now I need you to step back and let us do our job. The guard told me to come back tomorrow to meet with Ronald, Ethan said. This could be our only chance to find out what happened to my mother. Absolutely not, the detective said firmly. Under no circumstances are you to go back there. We'll send in an undercover officer, set up surveillance. There are proper procedures for this kind of situation. Ethan knew the detective was right, but the thought of waiting, of possibly missing their one lead after 14 years of nothing, was unbearable. Still, he recognized the danger, both to himself and to any potential investigation. Fine, he conceded. I won't go back there. Thank you, Detective Vans said, relief evident in his voice. I'm going to make some calls now, get things in motion. We'll keep you updated on any developments, I promise. One more thing, Ethan said before the detective could hang up. You should know that my father and siblings are at risk too. If these people realize we're investigating, I'll arrange for patrol cars to make regular passes by both your place and your father's house, Detective Vans assured him. Get some rest, Ethan, and stay away from that warehouse. After ending the call, Ethan sat in his parked car for several minutes, weighing his options. The detective's warnings were logical, and the danger was real. But 14 years of questions, of wondering what had happened to his mother, of being the only one who believed she hadn't abandoned them willingly, it all pushed against the rational part of his brain, urging caution. In the end, he pulled his car into his apartment parking lot, knowing that sleep would be impossible, but recognizing that he needed to think carefully about his next move. Whatever he decided, one thing was certain. He was closer to the truth about his mother's disappearance than he had ever been before. Morning arrived with a clarity that had eluded Ethan throughout his restless night. After tossing and turning for hours, he had finally fallen into a fitful sleep around 4 a.m., only to be awakened by his phone ringing at 7:30. The caller ID displayed Detective Vans's number. I'm on my way to pick you up, the detective said without preamble when Ethan answered. We're going to that warehouse, but we're doing it my way. Be ready in 15 minutes. True to his word, Detective Vans pulled up outside Ethan's apartment building exactly 15 minutes later. He was driving an unmarked police car, dressed in plain clothes rather than his usual suit, jeans, a faded button-down shirt, and a worn leather jacket that made him look more like a construction worker than a detective. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, noticing immediately that the detective wasn't alone. In the back seat sat another man, also in plain clothes, who Vans introduced simply as Officer Miller, Tactical Support. "I've been up all night coordinating this," Detective Vans explained as he pulled away from the curb. "Based on what you told me about Raymond Doss and his son Harvey, we're treating this as a potentially dangerous situation. I've got plainclothes officers stationed at strategic locations around the warehouse and a tactical team on standby a few blocks away." "Shouldn't we take my car?" Ethan suggested. "The guard saw it last night. It might seem less suspicious." Detective Vans considered this for a moment before nodding. "You're right, we'll switch vehicles at the next parking lot." 10 minutes later, they had transferred to Ethan's car, with Ethan behind the wheel and Detective Vans in the passenger seat. Officer Miller remained in the unmarked police car, which would now serve as part of the surveillance perimeter. "Remember, you're not to get out of the car unless I explicitly tell you to," Detective Vans instructed as they approached the industrial zone where the warehouse was located. "I'm only allowing you to come along because you've already made contact and your presence will seem less suspicious. But this is a police operation, not a family investigation." Ethan nodded, his mouth dry with anticipation and nervousness. As they turned onto the street leading to the warehouse, he could see the same pickup truck parked outside that had been there the night before. But something felt different. The place seemed quieter, more still. "Something's not right," Detective Vans muttered, his experienced eyes scanning the property. No movement, no vehicles except that truck. Ethan pulled into the gravel lot and parked in approximately the same spot as the previous night. They sat for a moment, observing the warehouse. The windows remained covered, but unlike the night before, no lights were visible inside. "Wait here," Detective Vans said, his hand moving to the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. "I'm going to take a quick look. If I signal you to leave, drive away immediately and meet Officer Miller at the rendezvous point." Ethan watched as the detective approached the building cautiously, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to assess dangerous situations. Vans first checked the pickup truck, peering through the windows before moving toward the side entrance, where Ethan had seen the guard emerge the night before. After trying the door and finding it unlocked, Detective Vans disappeared inside the building. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Ethan's anxiety grew with each passing moment, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. Finally, Detective Vans reappeared at the entrance, gesturing for Ethan to join him. Against his better judgment, but driven by the need to know, Ethan exited the car and hurried across the gravel lot. "It's empty," Detective Vans said as Ethan approached. "Completely cleared out. They must have left in a hurry after your visit last night." Ethan followed the detective into the warehouse, the smell of dust and abandonment filling his nostrils. The interior was cavernous and mostly empty, with clear indications that equipment and furniture had been recently removed, rectangular clean spots on the dusty floor, empty brackets on the walls where shelving had been attached, severed cables hanging from the ceiling. "They were definitely operating something here," Detective Vans observed, pointing to a section of the warehouse where partitions had created separate rooms. "Look at these. Makeshift living quarters, workstations. This was more than just storage." Ethan moved slowly through the space, trying to imagine his mother here, trying to understand what connection she might have had to this place. Had she been held against her will? Had she come here voluntarily seeking help to disappear? Or was there some other explanation entirely? "Over here," Detective Vans called from across the room. He was crouching beside an overturned desk, examining something on the floor. Ethan joined him to find the detective holding a photograph that had apparently slipped beneath the desk during the hasty evacuation. It showed a cargo ship docked at what appeared to be an industrial port, its name Eastern Horizon clearly visible on the hull. "Turn it over," Detective Vans said, handing the photograph to Ethan. On the back was handwritten information, the ship's name, a departure schedule dated for the following week, and a partial list of names that included Elizabeth C. and Ronald M. "They're planning to transport people on this ship," Detective Vans said, pulling out his phone. "And based on this list, Your mother might be one of them. He immediately radioed his team, requesting a search operation at the harbor and providing the name of the cargo ship. This is now highest priority, he instructed. We need to locate the eastern horizon and prevent its departure. Alert Harbor Patrol and Coast Guard. Turning to Ethan, he added, we need to get moving. If Ronald and his people left here last night, they might have accelerated their timetable. The ship could be preparing to leave sooner than scheduled. As they hurried back to the car, Detective Vans made another call, this time requesting officers to check on Dan and the rest of the family. After your visit last night, these people know someone's asking questions. We need to make sure your family is safe. Ethan felt a surge of fear for his siblings and father. I didn't think about that, he admitted. I was so focused on finding Mom. Call them, Detective Vans instructed as they got back into Ethan's car. Call each one individually and tell them what's happening. Tell them to stay where they are and that officers will be coming to secure their locations. As they drove toward the harbor, Ethan did as instructed, calling his father first. Then he called each of his siblings in turn, repeating the warning and instructions. Dan was shocked and furious. Mark and Leah were skeptical, Aldi confused, but all agreed to follow the detective's advice. They're all warned, Ethan reported to Detective Vans as they neared the harbor, but I'm not sure they really believe there's any danger. Better safe than sorry, the detective replied grimly. If Ronald and the DOS operation are as dangerous as I suspect, they won't hesitate to use your family as leverage if they feel cornered. The harbor came into view, a sprawling industrial port with numerous piers extending into the grey waters of the bay. Cargo ships of various sizes were docked along the wharves, loading or unloading their shipments, while smaller vessels navigated the channels between them. As they approached the main security gate, Detective Vans flashed his badge to the guard, explaining they were part of an ongoing police operation. The guard waved them through, directing them toward the harbour master's office. Inside, they found a flurry of activity. Several officers were already present, coordinating with harbour officials to locate the eastern horizon. "What's the status?" Detective Vans asked, approaching a uniformed officer who appeared to be leading the operation. "The eastern horizon left port last night," the officer reported, his expression grim. "Nearly 12 hours ahead of its filed departure time. Port Authority granted the early departure request due to cited weather concerns, though meteorological reports show no significant weather systems in the area." "They knew," Ethan said, the realization hitting him with crushing force. "They knew we were onto them as soon as I asked about my mother last night." Detective Vans placed a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We're not giving up. Harbour patrol boats are already in pursuit and we've alerted the Coast Guard. That ship can't have gone far in 12 hours. "What about here?" Ethan asked, gesturing toward the docks. "Couldn't some of Ronald's people still be around?" "We're one step ahead of you," the officer replied. "We've detained several dock workers who were involved in the Eastern Horizon's accelerated departure. They're being questioned now." Detective Vans nodded in approval. "Good work. Let's head to the station. I want to sit in on those interrogations." The drive to the police station was tense, with Detective Vans constantly on his phone coordinating the expanding investigation. Every few minutes, he received updates about the search for the Eastern Horizon or reports about the security measures being put in place to protect the Dawson family. "They've got eyes on the ship," he reported after one such call. "Coast Guard aircraft spotted it about 100 miles offshore heading south. They're dispatching vessels to intercept." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing with possibilities. Could his mother really be on that ship? After 14 years, was he finally close to finding her? When they arrived at the station, they found it buzzing with activity. Officers moved purposefully between departments, phones rang constantly, and an atmosphere of urgency permeated the building. To Ethan's surprise, his entire family was there, seated in a waiting area, Dan in his wheelchair looking bewildered and tired, Ellie standing protectively behind him, Mark and Leah seated side by side, their expressions a mixture of concern and skepticism, and Aldi fidgeting nervously in his chair. "What are you all doing here?" Ethan asked as he approached them. "I thought you were staying at home." "The police brought us in as a precaution," Mark explained, standing to face his brother. "They said it would be easier to protect us all in one location." "Protect us from what exactly?" Leah demanded, her arms crossed defensively. "Ethan, what have you done?" Before Ethan could respond, Detective Vans stepped forward. "Your brother may have uncovered the truth about your mother's disappearance," he said, his tone professional but kind. "And that truth could be dangerous for all of you." He quickly briefed the family on what they had discovered: the warehouse, the photograph of the cargo ship, the names on the list, and the possibility that Catherine had been forced to work for Ronald and the DOS operation. "So you're saying Mum didn't leave us voluntarily?" Ellie asked, her voice small and hopeful. "That she was taken?" "Based on the evidence we've gathered, it appears your mother may have become involved with a criminal organization run by Raymond Doss and his son Harvey," Detective Vans explained. "We believe she was forced to work for them, possibly because of a debt or other form of coercion." "That doesn't make any sense," Mark objected. "Mom didn't have any debts. Dad handled all the finances back then." Dan, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "That's not entirely true," he said quietly. All eyes turned to him in surprise. "After my accident, the medical bills were overwhelming," Dan continued, his voice strained with the effort of confession. "Our insurance didn't cover everything. Catherine was desperate. She tried to get bank loans, but we'd already maxed out our credit. I was in the hospital, then rehab. I didn't know what exactly she was doing to keep us afloat." "Dad," Ethan said, kneeling beside his father's wheelchair, "are you saying Mom might have borrowed money from someone like Raymond Doss?" Dan nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "She mentioned once, just once, that she'd found a way to handle the bills. She said not to worry, that she'd taken care of it. I was so focused on my recovery, on the pain, that I didn't ask questions. I should have asked questions." Detective Vans pulled up a chair and sat across from Dan. "Mr. Dawson, this is very important. Did your wife ever mention names? Raymond Doss, Ronald? Anyone connected to the loans?" Dan shook his head. "No specific names, but she did say something odd, about a week before she disappeared. She said everything she did for us. I thought she was just stressed, saying dramatic things because of the pressure we were under. I never imagined—" His voice broke, and Ellie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The men we arrested at the harbor are being questioned now," Detective Vans said, addressing the entire family. "We're hoping they can provide more information about the Eastern Horizon and whether your mother might be on board." "I want to talk to them," Ethan said firmly. Detective Vans hesitated. "That's not standard procedure, Ethan." "Please," Ethan insisted. "I'm the one who spoke to the guard at the warehouse. I might recognize someone, or they might recognize me." After a moment's consideration, Detective Vans nodded. "All right, but just as an observer. I do the talking." He led Ethan down a corridor to a room where they could watch the interrogations through a one-way mirror. Inside the adjacent room, a middle-aged man in dock worker's clothing sat handcuffed to a table, being questioned by two officers. "That's not the guard I met," Ethan said, studying the man. They observed for several minutes as the dock worker stubbornly refused to provide any information beyond his name and employment at the harbor. Detective Vans made notes on a pad, occasionally murmuring observations about the man's body language or responses. "Let's try the next one," he suggested, after it became clear they would get nothing useful from this suspect. In the second interrogation room, they found an older man being questioned, and Ethan immediately tensed. "That's him," he said urgently. "That's the guard from the warehouse." Detective Vans studied the man through the glass. "You're sure?" "Positive," Ethan confirmed. "He's the one who told me about Ronald." The detective nodded thoughtfully. "Let's listen in." Unlike the dock worker, the guard seemed almost relaxed despite his circumstances, answering questions with a detached calm that bordered on amusement. When asked about his employment, he freely admitted to working security for Harvey Doss. When questioned about the Eastern Horizon, he claimed no knowledge of its cargo or destination. He's lying, Ethan muttered. He knew about my mother. He all but admitted she was there. Detective Vans watched the interrogation for a few more minutes before making a decision. I'm going in. Stay here and watch. Ethan observed as Detective Vans entered the interrogation room, introduced himself to the other officers, and took a seat across from the guard. The detective's approach was different, less confrontational, more conversational. You know, we've been watching that warehouse for a while, Vans said casually, though Ethan knew this to be a bluff. We've identified most of the people who were held there, including Catherine Dawson. The guard's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension appeared in his shoulders. We know she was forced to work for Doss, probably because of a loan she couldn't repay, Detective Vans continued. What we don't know is whether she's still alive and whether she's on that ship. I don't know what you're talking about, the guard replied evenly. That's interesting, Detective Vans said, leaning forward slightly, because you seem to know exactly who she was when her son mentioned her name last night. A flicker of recognition crossed the guard's face, quickly suppressed. Her son is here, by the way, the detective added. He identified you immediately, and let me tell you, he's pretty determined to find his mother after 14 years of believing she abandoned him and his family. The guard remained silent, but his eyes darted briefly toward the mirror. Here's the thing, Detective Vans continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. We're going to catch up with that ship. The Coast Guard is already in pursuit, and when we do, everyone on board is going to start talking to save themselves. Ronald, Harvey Doss, they'll throw you under the bus in a heartbeat to reduce their own sentences. The guard's composure finally showed cracks. He shifted in his seat, gaze dropping to the table. You're looking at serious time, Detective Vans pressed. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, probably human trafficking. But if you help us now, if you tell us where that ship is headed and whether Catherine Dawson is on board, I can put in a good word with the prosecutor. For a long moment the guard said nothing. Then he sighed heavily, the sound of a man making a difficult calculation. I'm old, he said finally. I'm sick. Prison's just another place to die. Then why not do one good thing before you go? Detective Vans suggested. Help a family find their mother. The guard considered this, then leaned forward, speaking quietly. I can't tell you where the ship is going. I genuinely don't know. That information is compartmentalized, but I can give you access to something that might help. What's that? There's an app, a secure messaging system we use. My login might still work. It has a GPS tracker for the ship, security camera feeds from on board. It's how Ronald keeps tabs on everything. Detective Vans perked up visibly. And you're willing to provide this access? The guard nodded slowly. Like I said, I'm dying anyway. Might as well do something decent for once. Detective Vans slid a notepad across the table. Write down the login information, everything we need to access it. As the guard began writing, Ethan felt a surge of hope unlike anything he'd experienced in 14 years. For the first time, he had concrete evidence that his mother hadn't abandoned them and might still be alive. Detective Vans emerged from the interrogation room with a grim satisfaction. The guard's login information clutched in his hand. Let's get this to the tech team immediately, he said to Ethan as they hurried down the corridor. If this app works like he says, we might be able to locate the ship and even get visual confirmation of who's on board. They headed to a room where several officers sat at computer terminals, working with focused intensity. Detective Vans handed the login information to a tech specialist, explaining its significance. We need to access this app without alerting anyone monitoring the system, he instructed. Can you do that? The specialist studied the information, then nodded confidently. I should be able to create a mirrored session that won't trigger any security alerts. Give me a few minutes. Ethan and Detective Vans returned to the waiting area, where the rest of the Dawson family remained. As they approached, Ethan could see the strain on each face, the hope warring with disbelief, the fear of disappointment after so many years of resignation. Did you learn anything? Mark asked, standing as they entered. Potentially, Detective Vans replied cautiously. The guard provided access to an app that might help us locate the ship and confirm who's on board. Our tech team is working on it now. And you really think Mom might be alive? Aldi asked, his young face a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. That she didn't leave us on purpose? It's looking that way, Ethan said gently. Dad just told us about the medical bills, how Mom was trying to find money to pay them. It makes sense now. She might have borrowed from DOS, couldn't repay, and they forced her to work for them. But for 14 years? Leah objected, though her usual skepticism was weakened by uncertainty. Without any contact at all. These organizations operate by isolating people, Detective Vans explained. They separate families, use threats and coercion to maintain control. If Catherine believed contacting you would put you in danger, she might have stayed away to protect you. Dan reached out to grasp Ethan's hand, his eyes filled with tears. I should have known, he whispered. All these years I thought she'd abandoned us because I was broken, because I couldn't take care of our family anymore. None of us knew, Dad, Ethan reassured him, squeezing his father's hand. But we're going to find her now. We're going to bring her home. Detective Vans's phone rang, interrupting the emotional moment. He answered it quickly, listening intently before saying, "We'll be right there." Turning to the family, he announced, "The tech team has accessed the app. They want us all in the computer lab immediately." They moved as a group down the corridor, Dan's wheelchair pushed by Mark while Ellie and Leah walked on either side of their father, protective and supportive. Aldi stayed close to Ethan, occasionally glancing up at his oldest brother with newfound respect. The computer lab was a large room filled with monitors, servers, and technical equipment. The specialist who had been working on the app beckoned them over to a central workstation where a large screen displayed what appeared to be a map with a blinking dot moving slowly across an expanse of blue. "That's the eastern horizon," the specialist explained, pointing to the dot. "According to the GPS tracker, it's approximately 120 miles offshore and heading south-southeast. We've already relayed these coordinates to the Coast Guard." "Can you access the security cameras?" Detective Vans asked. The specialist nodded, typing rapidly. "The app has limited access to certain security feeds, primarily in work areas rather than private quarters. I'm cycling through them now." The large screen split into multiple smaller screens, each showing a different area of the ship. Most displayed cargo holds, corridors, or mechanical spaces, but a few showed what appeared to be makeshift workrooms, where people, mostly women, sat at tables or computer terminals. "Stop," Ethan said suddenly, pointing to one of the feeds. "Can you enlarge that one?" The specialist expanded the indicated feed to fill the screen. It showed a room with several women seated at computers, their faces half turned away from the camera as they worked. "Can you zoom in on that woman in the back?" Ethan requested, his heart racing. As the image zoomed and enhanced, a collective gasp arose from the Dawson family. Though 14 years older, her hair now streaked with grey and her face thinner than they remembered, there was no mistaking the woman working at the computer. "Mom," Ellie whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dan reached out a trembling hand toward the screen, as if trying to touch his wife across the miles that separated them. "Catherine," he murmured brokenly. Detective Vans immediately got on his phone, relaying the confirmation to the Coast Guard teams pursuing the ship. "We have visual confirmation of at least one kidnapping victim on board. Repeat, visual confirmation of Catherine Dawson, missing person for 14 years. Proceed with all caution. There are multiple potential victims on board." Turning to the Dawson family, he explained, "The Coast Guard should intercept the ship. They'll secure the vessel and safely remove everyone on board. We'll need to maintain radio silence about this to avoid alerting anyone on the ship who might be monitoring communications." "What do we do now?" Mark asked, his earlier skepticism completely dissolved in the face of irrefutable evidence that their mother was alive. "We wait," Detective Vans replied simply, "and we prepare for your mother's return." Dan sat silently in his wheelchair, tears occasionally sliding down his cheeks as he stared at the image of his wife. Ellie and Leah huddled together, sometimes whispering, sometimes simply holding hands in silent support. Mark paced the room, his practical nature seeking outlet in movement. Aldi alternated between sitting beside his father and joining Ethan, who stood resolutely by the main monitor, refusing to look away for more than a few seconds at a time. "I knew it," Ethan said quietly to Detective Vans during a moment when they stood slightly apart from the others. "All these years I knew she would never have left us willingly." "You never gave up on her," the detective observed. "That kind of faith is rare." "She was the one who never gave up on us," Ethan corrected him. "Whatever happened, whatever they did to her, she survived. For 14 years she survived." In the quiet of that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their mother's continued existence, Ethan understood something profound about the nature of family bonds. Faith wasn't simply believing without proof, it was holding on to truth when everything around him suggested otherwise. For 14 years his family had fractured under the weight of abandonment, each member crafting their own armor against the pain. Yet beneath that armor, the connection remained, waiting to be reforged. As they stood on the precipice of reunion, Ethan realized that courage wasn't about facing external dangers, but about confronting the fear of hope itself, the terrifying vulnerability of believing that broken things could be made whole again. Their mother had endured captivity to protect them. Now they would brave the unknown to bring her home. Whatever challenges awaited them on that cargo ship, they would face them together, no longer as fragments of a shattered family, but as what they had always been beneath the scars and silence, a constellation of lives bound by an unbreakable thread of love that neither time nor distance could sever.